All right, so let's start off with some basics. Let's talk about the current leadership of the UK. As you remember, we separate two distinct roles of executives in a given nation state's government at the national level, the head of state function and the head of government function. And in many cases, these two are fused into one person, but this is not the case in a constitutional monarchy such as the UK. The head of state, which is more of a ceremonial role with serious historical implications and cultural sort of ties to the past of that nation. And as it says there, a symbol of unity that the entire nation can sort of rally around and relate to is currently King Charles III. And the current head of government, which is the individual who actually makes decisions that affect policy. Although there is, that slight fact that, for instance, when there is a new prime minister who is the head of government in the UK, they have to go ahead along with their cabinet to go and visit with the current monarch and get the monarch's blessing and whatnot. But that individual, nonetheless, is the true power center and the source of all policy. And that person currently is Sir Keir Starmer, representing the Labour Party. They get that way, and they get that ability to shape policy by winning the majority of the seats in the House of Commons. And the interesting thing to note here is that it's a fused situation in which a member of the legislature is chosen based on their leadership of the party and elevated to an executive state. And there isn't really a separate election like we're going to find in some federal republics, in which, and some semi-presidential systems, in which you elect an individual differently outside of the legislature strictly for the executive role. And then you also elect members to go sit in that parliament or that Congress, right? So one person must win their own constituency, their own district or whatnot in their given country, and then go ahead and then have their party win the overall amount of seats. That's the largest of all the other parties. If they have a majority of them, then that person who leads that party is elevated to the prime minister position. And again, like I said, we're fusing powers here, right? You must be a part of the legislature, and then and only then are you able to go ahead and possibly become the executive. Speaking of labor, as we get into the political parties and the elite structure here, you have two larger parties and a bunch of smaller ones. So this is a true multi-party system inside of the UK. The current left center-ish party is the Labour Party, as aforementioned, led by Sir Keir Starmer. Um, the name implies that yes, there were ties to working class people. Labor is a giveaway for that, and they're very much into sort of a regime that focuses on trying to uplift individuals who are struggling economically and provide them with a decent standard of living according to what they think is an appropriate standard of living. Whereas the conservatives, who lost handily to Labor last election, basically are more representative of more upper business class and sort of a bit more into things like deregulation, privatization, a bit more willing to go ahead and dismantle parts of the welfare state to preserve others, and trying to turn the UK's political realm into something a bit more akin to maybe the US, for lack of a better example. Um, Other parties have been, relatively relevant in certain cases. The Labour Party supplanted the Liberal Party early in the 20th century, and the Liberal Party had to then move on and do a fusion of their own with the Social Democrats to form the Lib Dems, as they're known, the Liberal Democrats, who are increasingly becoming more and more relevant in local elections recently. And you have also a large number of other regional parties, right? As you recall, the UK is a nation that's a fusion of four different nations into one nation state, right? So that's going to be England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, right? Those are the four nations inside of the UK. And so each of them have their own sort of party pushing for more regional interests, and probably the most significant of them in terms of occasionally making some waves to push for a referendum or a yes no vote to have Scotland leave the UK would be the SNP, the Scottish National Party. The main idea here basically is that if you are in the driver's seat as the majority party, you get to run a government and form what's called a party government. In that situation, all your opposition or your main opposition forms what's called the shadow government to critique you, but you get to drive the car or policy and you're behind the wheel as long as you basically go ahead and continue to have that majority. Sometimes you don't have a majority, you have what's called a hung parliament. In that case, individuals with large voting blocks who don't quite have a majority have to start reaching out to other small parties hoping to form what's called a coalition government, and offer them maybe some seats in terms of the maybe the chancellorship, or perhaps the secretary of the exchequer, which is effectively like the treasury individual, something like that, some kind of sweetener in the cabinet, in order to go ahead and activate these smaller parties to get them to go along with what you're trying to push in your policies. So let's go back a little bit and think about what's happened to help sort of be an impetus for change and suggest policy inputs, right? Remember, in our systems model, demands and supports are fed into a government, and a government then puts out decisions, which we call policy, right? So here are some of the sort of inputs, and here's how some of them have become outputs, right? Like the Labor Party didn't come out of nowhere. It was formed in the crucible of political resistance to laissez-faire policies during the last, second half of in the 19th century of the Industrial Revolution in the UK. And the Trade Unions Congress was able to go ahead and start agitating for more and more change to get more and more suffrage rights for individuals who were of lower economic standing, but still, working class individuals. And as more and more working class individuals who were pushing for their very narrow definition of what they sought out to be their own rights for their own well being, began to separate themselves from other leftist sort of politicians who were maybe pushing just more pure socialism, or maybe were pushing a more intellectual kind of middle class version of leftism in the UK. Then they start to create the Labour Party itself, which then sort of leapfrogs Liberal Party, as we talked about earlier, right? That's an example of leftist activism creating some social change and some political realities right there. We can get into a more sort of right wing situation, talking about the most recent referendum to have major policy implications in the UK when we're talking about Brexit, right? There was a situation where Euroscepticism, and when you're a Eurosceptic, it means that you basically don't look at the European Union as some sort of panacea for all of the social, political, and economic problems of the EU. You want to be more isolationist from it and retreat away from the European Union as opposed to engage more in it, right? And what we see here is that reform groups led by men like Nigel Farage and whatnot began to agitate for more and more change, and essentially started calling for UK to leave, hence the term Brexit, right? Great Britain leaving the European Union. And essentially, that decision, which happened during the tenure of David Cameron, ended up being quite momentous. And we're going to probably get into that a little bit lower on in the review here. But basically, the idea here is that it's, most analysts will agree now there's mostly social forces and demographic forces that were kind of pushing individuals to seek to want to leave the European Union. And as a result, a party, a small party, but a party nonetheless, now exists, known as Reform UK. They have a handful of seats in the House of Commons, but they might be a possible force to reshape overall conservative thought in UK politics. That being said, either way, when we're looking at how the pendulum swings either left or right in UK politics, the government generally tends to allow people to express themselves very freely. They tend to keep these sort of policy vacillations back and forth tied to institutional situations so that nothing sort of seems like it's outside threat to tear down any existing institutions. And for the most part, this is why I think, in this course particularly, and in the European sphere, the UK gets very high marks in Freedom House and is considered to be a very much a free country in that regard. Speaking of institutions, remember the UK is a unitary parliamentary system, right? Unitary, as in one parliament, the UK parliament oversees all the legal developments of all parts, all four nations. It is true that some places, such as Scotland, have their own sort of miniature parliaments there as a sign towards giving them some little bits of autonomy in the future. And we'll get into devolution in a moment. But what we see essentially is that one rule of law that can be influenced and changed by one parliament, superseding all other legal bodies in the country, hence unitary parliamentary system, right? This parliament is bicameral, has two chambers, right? The House of Commons, which is elected, and the House of Lords, which is appointed. And the stronger of the two for sure is the House of Commons. The House of Lords can occasionally gum up the works and policy making for the House of Commons and pose some issues for the Prime Minister and his or her party government. But for the most part, they end up being kind of like second fiddle in terms of overall strength to the House of Commons. These folks get elected vis-a-vis a first past the post or FPTP rather system, in which their country is carved up into 650 different single member districts called constituencies, right? And what we see here basically is that because of that number, and we also know that, when you have even numbers, it's possible to have a tie, right? And so we tend to like in some democracies to have odd numbered districts so that therefore you avoid that possibility of a tie, or odd numbers of legislators to avoid that possibility of a tie. We have an even number here, all with the same amount of population. So some of them will be much larger geographically on the map in like northern England, places of Scotland, places like Wales, where they're not as densely populated. And some of them will be very small and very concentrated in regions around the big cities such as London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, etc. Right? And you can, because of that number and because of the multiplicity of parties, you can sometimes not have a result that is yielding a majority. In that case, like I said before, you have a hung parliament, then the parties need to come together and start doing some horse trading between them to settle on some sort of coalition government. All right. Whatever the UK does to change, it does so gradually, right? That's one of the key word wall terms that we use, gradualism. All right. And so this slow evolutionary change kind of matches the historical sort of feel and sweep of the UK, in that you saw the very seed, the very little germ of the parliament system that we see today being formed at the signing of the Magna Carta by King John, right? That was many, many centuries ago, almost 1,000 years ago. And in that way, you can think of the UK as being one of the oldest, uh, if not the oldest, parliamentary systems on the planet. And they did not stay that stable by being subject to such rapid change back and forth. You did have that one moment with Cromwell where they kind of took over and kicked out the monarchy, but every government's going to go through some upheaval occasionally, right? The Americans had their Civil War, right? But in this case, what we find is that with a relatively homogeneous population, with a relatively homogeneous culture, right? You go through slow evolutionary change over a time, and you don't have such rapid swings back and forth. Um, and so again, what we see here is that expansion of suffrage happened over a long-term scale, starting in 1832 with the Rate Reform Act, and eventually moving through to about 100 years later until all working class men and women can vote, right? The House of Lords were very slowly sort of phased out by the time you got to the 18th century, to the House of Commons and their prime minister having basically all the power to create policy, and them being just basically put to the sidelines as individuals who could be consulted on policy matters, but eventually had to assent anyway if they wanted. But we will see that as the UK demographic changes and new political ideas are introduced from individuals who, might not have been born there, and there's more interaction with other EU states to sort of buffet the waves of the shores politically of the UK. Things like Brexit might end up being some of the first true, like, major tests of institutional strength that we see going on in the UK. So, okay, let's take a look and see who really runs stuff, right? Your main power players, essentially, there's a parliament and the prime minister. I want to banish the idea right now of the monarch having any real policy power to. I guess the monarch could suggest stuff to the prime minister, and the prime minister could consult with the monarch over some things. But technically, by law, King Charles III has to approve of any single law passed by Keir Starmer's majority in the House of Commons, even a law that would abolish the aforementioned monarch's position. That's kind of crazy to think about, right? Like, he'd have to, by law, sign the bill that basically makes him abdicate the throne if they were to do that. Now, King Charles is, say what you want about him. A lot of people are still Queen Elizabeth fans and everything, and rest in power and all that. Although maybe some people in the colonies, the former colonies, might not say rest in power to Queen Elizabeth, but we'll talk about that a little later when we get to Nigeria. But the situation is such that because of that cultural reverence for the position that he holds, he's far more popular right now, a political figure in the actual UK than Keir Starmer is, right? But besides all that, the prime minister, again, still has the keys to the policy car, still behind the wheel, right? Other parties can go ahead and sort of make some waves. There are local elections inside of the UK, which basically gives people a chance to see sort of like who might the parties put up in the constituencies for possible parliament seats in the House of Commons. And that is an intriguing development to watch and see who might be on the precipice of a major jump in terms of the number of parliamentary seats. So it's not like all the other parties just sit and wait until the other party that runs the majority screws up. Like, they're constantly working to try to reach out and win more of these 650 different battleground constituencies, right? Groups like the BBC and other media outlets like the Guardian are very powerful in terms of shaping people's perception of how well the party government is doing and how viable the other shadow government might be if they were in power. And of course, like I said, the UK is an incredibly literate population and incredibly opinionated as well. And so, being that literate, being that opinionated, their ideas and their notions over what the proper use of the House of Commons power is, where the policy focuses should be, what sorts of plans are viable, which ones aren't, will definitely shape a lot of the prime minister's thinking in terms of how do I push the agenda of the party and succeed and pass laws so I seem effective so my party can stay in power while also not messing up anything to the point where somebody might think that the party is falling off and might start to shift their support elsewhere, right? Let's go back in time a little bit. How did we get to this point inside of UK politics? Well, let's take it back to in the postmodern era to Winston Churchill, right? People forget that yes, he was the prime minister during World War II, but he did not finish World War II as prime minister. He represents the conservative Tories, right? He then loses to Labor in 45. And then this guy, Clement Attlee, takes over. But he comes back in 1950 to 55 during the early Cold War period. And this is a key moment of leadership here because during that time, because of the situation of the utter devastation of the British military during World War II, who emerges victorious, but it's very much a Pyrrhic victory. Their navy is battered. Um, it's challenging. They had to start thinking about what our priorities are. Should we focus more on maintaining the empire and maintaining the military presence needed to control that empire? Or should we double down more of our resources on our own citizens here in the home islands? An individual by the name of William Beveridge writes a famous report that shows that we probably get better results if we do go ahead and start actually helping to increase the middle class and the overall standard of living in the UK by dialing down some of the military spending and eventually letting the empire go. That's all about what Labor is trying to do. But as conservatives who were conditionally a bit more hawkish, especially as a man who spent his time fighting the fascist governments of the world, right, in terms of Winston Churchill, he agrees as a leader of the conservatives at that time to say, look, let's do that. Let's start to go ahead and have not only a national health service, right, the NHS, which gives universal health care in the UK, but also let's start talking about a universal, a national pension system, which is roughly like a guaranteed retirement thing akin to Social Security in the US, right? That's what we mean by consensus right there. We're going to do everything that we can as both the left party and the right party to not mess with that. We're going to make sure that people have their pensions and people have a chance to get seen by doctors and boost the overall standard of living in the UK to have a thriving middle class. And as a result, the Gini, right, that sort of measure of income inequality very much decreases during this time frame while this is intact during the Cold War. Then it starts to get a little bit of a threat from a whole new model during the 80s, pushing things like supply side economics, things like deregulation, things like privatizing what used to be nationalized or heavily regulated industries, and sort of the poster child for that in UK politics, and still definitely one of the most revered prime ministers in recent history is the Iron Lady herself, Margaret Thatcher. All right. And I have, it's funny, they put the little suitcase there. I think maybe it's for, like, being all about like the corporate worker and stuff. Because the idea here was that, and this is akin to a lot of things going on. We're going to see a major wave of deregulation take place, not only in the UK, but also in North America. We get to Mexico, and then also heading over in the Far East. We start talking about Deng Xiaoping in the PRC. But in this case, the notion that over reliance on the welfare state was sort of causing there to be inefficiencies in production, and that if a bit more, sort of flexibility was given to business owners to choose what their wages would be for their workers, to choose what the prices would be for their goods, and how they would go ahead and sell these goods, then what you would find is that there'd be some economic growth. And this was a time of some stagnation, as you might know from A Push, right? The US is going through a bit of an issue in the mid 80s during the Reagan era with a bit of a recession there, which is kind of I'd say like an echo of the previous stagflation, which took place during the late 70s, right? And so through these initiatives, Thatcher is able to create some decent GDP growth there during her tenure, which went all the way up into 1990, right? But in the mid 90s, the story changes to be all about Tony Blair's New Labor and what he called his third way. The idea of moving the Labor Party away from strictly leftist policies, pro worker policies, and trying to appeal more to these middle class people who were open, you know, to some more privatization and to more deregulation. Um, if you look at, I have a slide on this in notes. If you look at the overall roster of who's winning these general elections, which remember happen every 5 years. This was a snap election in between, but every 5 years the UK has another general election. Um, you'll find that the vast majority of the postmodern elections were Conservative Party victories. That could indicate to some, such as Tony Blair and his right hand man, Gordon Brown, it could indicate that maybe there's a bit more of a rightward lean, a bit more conservative lean overall to the UK politically and its culture, which meant that if Labour was going to be relevant in the future, Labour had to pivot more toward the center to match a little bit of that rightward lean. And so this new Labour situation, which is going to fuse together aspects of the welfare state with open market policies, is going to go ahead and become the new way that they're able to win. And they do enjoy some good gains during the 90s and the 2000s politically. But I mean, that's hard to say whether that's his doing or if it's really more something akin to basically being the prime minister during the internet and the tech boom. I think if I was the PM of the UK during the tech boom, I'd become quite popular too, I think. But that kind of centrism wasn't just something that was happening then. That pro corporate centrism was happening in the US with Bill Clinton as president. And in these sorts of things are definitely related in that sort of regard. Then we come down to the man who called the Brexit referendum. The last time we had a coalition government in the UK, it was led by David Cameron. It was a combination of the Conservatives and some Lib Dems, I believe. And he was definitely the main champion for the Stay coalition, trying to get people to realize that there are more benefits in staying in the EU if you were the UK than in leaving. And he was so confident about it that he went ahead and called like a snap referendum. He thought for sure he could beat the leave component like 60-40. Then it turned out it was more like 50, 54, 46-ish, 53, 47 against him, that individuals such as the aforementioned Nigel Farage and a future PM under the Conservatives, Boris Johnson, were able to go ahead and convince the voters of the UK that, yes, there are more benefits to leaving than to staying. Highly unfortunate in terms of individuals who had businesses that were tied to EU nations, because a very laborious, very fraught system of renegotiation with the EU was then had to take place after, when the Conservative Party was able to go ahead and sort of wrestle some sort of control back in the form of Theresa May, like I said later on, Boris Johnson, trying to find their way back home economically with the EU members who were not so keen as to go ahead and give them all the trade advantages that they had while they were in the EU before they left, right? I mean, they even got to keep their currency, right? They were in the EU and they didn't have to use euros. They could still use pounds, for instance, right? So keep that in mind, that historians are still going back and forth on, is that the most recent major historical blunder in UK politics, leaving the European Union. So you see the continuity there. Churchill, conservatives say, okay, we'll keep, these state welfare policies and stuff. That's all good. We won't touch those. Thatcher starts to reconsider, like, well, but I will privatize some industry. I will go ahead and deregulate some industry too. And then Blair is saying, yeah, I'm gonna have to go super pro corporate, but still maintain some connection to these welfare state policies. Then we go to Cameron, who is dealing with the demographic pressure of Brexit, kind of fumbles the proverbial bag on that. Brexit happens. And so now here we are in a Stelmar realm where the Conservative Party under Sunak had completely sort of, lost credibility with the people to the point where Labor comes in last general election and crushes and installs Starmer as the PM. But he's running a new Labor thing very similar to what Blair was running. The genie is starting to grow, which shows more and more income inequality as he cozies up to, sort of corporate entities and whatnot, seeking any sort of way to grow UK's GDP, which has been very anemic in their growth rates. And that's the one thing I think all politicians are acutely aware of, right? Any sort of economic sort of crisis is very, very apt to doom your candidacy and or your administration, right? So now Starmer's stuck, right? He is so far to the center. He doesn't really seem to be the ally of the working person. And he sounds so conservative in some ways, especially on immigration. He almost sounds more like Nigel Farage, and his policies almost end up doing Nigel Farage's work for him, right? He sounds like one of these Reform UK sort of Eurosceptic individuals who wanted to break away because of this influx of individuals from Eastern Europe and from overseas, such as the former colonies in Africa and South Asia. So it's difficult to forecast what's going on with New Labor under Starmer. His approval ratings are pretty awful by most global standards, but that's sort of the thing about the UK, right? Despite the fact that they don't like individual politicians at all, they do have institutions which allow for party politics to exist in a way to foster much competition between them, such that at least kind of overtly voters feel like they have a lot of options when they go to submit their ballots in the ballot box, right, at the polling booth. There's still much respect for Parliament as a whole, even as they try to devolve and send more powers and more autonomy to other regions that feel like the UK Parliament's maybe too heavy-handed. So that could be another future gradual sort of situation that's going to happen in UK politics, more sharing of authority from the United UK Parliament to other smaller parliaments such as the Scottish one. But the institutions remain strong. The parties aren't going anywhere. Even as weak as conservatives have gotten, I think the Conservative Party will come back. And even if Labor takes a whooping next general election, they'll sort out who among them is more apt to lead. And so they'll be able to come back later on. This is our only real, true, functioning, fused executive, legislative parliament in the course. And so comparing and contrasting this parliament with the Russian Duma, for instance, could be something they might want to ask you. This is also a very healthy multi-party system. So you might get some questions about how first past the post ends up yielding these multi-party situations, especially because in some cases, first past the post tends to lead more towards a two-party system. And of course, they'll talk about how the structures stay so robust and so legitimate in this particular nation state of the UK. So that's all we have for the UK. I want to make these sort of brief so we get in, get out, main themes. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you next time. Good luck on the test.